The International Monetary Fund has warned of a potential global recession due to the economic shocks from the war in the Middle East. The IMF notes US and Israeli strikes on Iran, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz and strikes on energy infrastructure in Gulf countries have rocked global markets and will likely push growth down from 2025. The body's chief economist says the reopening of the Strait can avoid the worst outcomes, but says there are three possible scenarios the IMF must consider should talks fail.
Our report presents three scenarios. Our reference forecast assumes a short-lived conflict and a moderate 19% rise in energy prices in 2026. Still, some damage will not be avoided. Global growth falls to 3.1% this year, a downgrade from January forecast, and headline inflation rises to 4.4%. Our adverse scenario assumes further disruption, leading to higher energy prices and inflation expectations and tighter financial conditions throughout the year. Growth falls to 2.5% this year and inflation rises to 5.4%. Our severe scenario assumes that energy supply disruptions extend into next year with greater macro instability. Global growth falls to 2% this year and next, while inflation exceeds 6%.
And the IMF issued warnings to governments across the globe about how to respond to the crisis. So let's get more on this from our political reporter, Stephanie Boris. Stephanie, just what are governments and central banks being told to do here by the IMF?
Hi, Gemma. So the problem that we're looking at that the IMF has outlined if the war in the Middle East continues for some time is that there'll be higher energy prices, there'll be higher food prices, inflation will also rise, but growth will slow. And if it slows to that 2%, we're expecting to see a global recession, the third in this century. So in terms of how to try and combat that, the IMF says that the real focus should be around inflation, therefore combating that through interest rate hikes, and that should be the focus over trying to get economy growth up. Now, here in Australia, a number of economists are predicting that the Reserve Bank will be likely to increase interest rates given inflation is continuing to rise. Aside from the IMF report, we've had recent modelling from Treasury here in Australia suggesting that inflation will continue to rise if the war in the Middle East continues. The IMF also said that there shouldn't be sort of very broad approaches to how to help people with cost of living pressures. So in Australia, we have seen the government introduce a cut to the fuel excise. Instead, the IMF is saying if there's any support, it should be very targeted to vulnerable businesses and households.
And how has Treasurer Jim Chalmers responded to this report?
Well, this report comes, about a month out from the federal budget being announced here in Australia, and the Treasurer said that the budget the government was preparing in February is now very different to what they're preparing now, given what we're seeing over in the Middle East. The Treasurer says these are sobering figures, but not to be unexpected given the modelling Treasury's done here in Australia and given what we're seeing in the Middle East play out and with all of that uncertainty. He was speaking this morning at the airport as he's flying out to the US shortly and was asked to respond to the IMF report.
The IMF is sounding the alarm on some pretty severe scenarios that they have published overnight. This is a very serious, very dangerous time for the world. Now, Australia is better placed and better prepared than a number of other countries, but we won't be spared the fallout from this very substantial economic shock. Now, we are expecting in our own economy, in our own forecasts, for our economy to slow, and we are expecting inflation to be higher as a consequence of this war in the Middle East.
Now, Gemma, the point of the Treasurer's trip to the US is to speak with a number of his counterparts from across the world, but because of the war in the Middle East, the focus will in the end be on that. Specifically for the Australian government, there are concerns around fuel supply, and we know that the Treasurer will be speaking to a number of his counterparts specifically about fuel, including Korea, Japan, China, the UK and Indonesia.